Let's talk about the news of the day. You can see from the headline here from our friends at Loudwire, some Stranger Things fans are now trying to cancel Metallica, and Twitter reacts. So to make a long story short, this girl on TikTok, she hosts a fan series on the social media platform called Is Your Fave Problematic that covers many different musical artists. So for those who don't speak woke, I will translate. Is Your Fave Problematic means here is where I try to cancel a bunch of artists that you like. That's what that means. Because the answer to that question, is your fave problematic, is always yes. Yes, your fave is problematic. And here's why. I'll just skip all this stuff. Here's what it is. We can watch her video. But first, I'd like to thank Riff Hard for sponsoring this video. Riff Hard is the world's best online school for metal guitarists. In full disclosure, yes, I am a partner in the company. This month on Riff Hard, your instructor is Aaron Marshall, aka Intervals. As many of you probably know, he's one of the leaders of this generation of progressive guitarists. I know him well. He's also incredibly smart and a great teacher. And in his lessons, he shows a lot of his signature techniques like hybrid picking, alternate picking, and syncopation using examples from some of his songs. And he also does a full breakdown of how to play his song Vanta Black note for note. You'll also get access to the entire library of lessons, including people like Dean Lamb from Archspire, Dan Sugarman of Ice Nine Kills, Wes Hawk, Kevin Thrasher from Escape the Fate, and last but definitely not least, you will also get access to our exclusive members-only community of guitarists. It's super positive, super cool. So if you want to check out Riff Hard, just hit the link in the description of this video. Join now and you will get your first month for just $1. Let's see who else she's tried to cancel. Ariana Grande, Harry Styles, Lady Gaga, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Radiohead, Demi Lovato, Selena Gomez, Cigarettes After Sex, Gwen Stefani, Ice Nine Kills. Man, she's got a whole series here. Look at this. She's on episode 65 now. She is just out to cancel everybody. Look at her go. All right. Well, let's see what she has to say about Metallica. The description says, I find it interesting that they only cared about gatekeeping in their fandom when they started getting big again from Stranger Things. They only care about what lines their pockets with like the world's worst spelling. So this girl may know how to make TikToks, but she does not know how to type. I think this part is kind of funny. When they started getting big again from Stranger Things, as though Metallica was ever anything but like one of the biggest artists in any genre on the planet. Like the Black Album, which came out in 1991, like continues to chart in the Billboard Top 200 all the time. And she turned off comments here. If you have to turn comments off on any kind of content, that's probably a sign that you were in the wrong. But let's just see what she has to say.
Welcome back to Is Your Fave Problematic? On this episode, we're going to be covering Metallica. This band is ancient, so let's just jump straight in because it's going to be very long.
They are ancient.
But before we start, let's have some content warnings. And starting off with a bang, there is their anti...
Did she say starting off with a bing? Like Chandler Bing from Friends?
And starting off with a bang, there is their...
Yes, she said starting off with a bing. I like that. Starting off with a bing. Okay.
First, there's this picture of Hetfield and Ulrich doing a Nazi salute.
So she first says, here's evidence of their anti-Semitism. This is Lars and James doing, a Sieg Heil from looks like back in the 80s. And it looks like James is also doing this with his finger, probably, mimicking like a Hitler mustache. This is not cool. Like, I'm not here to make any excuses for anything that they may have done or not done. This is not a cool thing to have done. However, this is probably from like 1988. This is probably like 35 years old.
More recently, Hetfield plays on this guitar that contains iron crosset. And if you don't know...
And here she is saying he has this iron cross on his guitar.
This guitar that contains iron crosset. And if you don't know, iron crosses are neo-Nazi dog whistle symbols.
The iron cross is a neo-Nazi dog whistle symbol, according to her. I'll tell you what it also is, among many other things. It is also a skateboarder, dog whistle, and Orange County choppers, lots of other things. So it is true that in some cases, that is like a, neo-Nazi symbol or whatever. But there's an awful lot of people out there with Iron Cross stickers on their trucks where I don't think it really means anything. So I think the Sieg Heil picture that they did is not cool. The Iron Cross thing, I'm not so sure about that. That's right. It actually is from the Crusades. That's true. Now there's this.
He hung out with Kerry King, this Aryan Brotherhood looking motherfucker right here.
Okay. No. Kerry King. Nobody is going to accuse him of being an intellectual giant. This is a picture from probably the early 90s. You wear your X and I'll wear mine. That's what the Kerry King shirt says. This is probably around the time that the Malcolm X movie came out, when a lot of people were wearing the X hats for Malcolm X. For anybody who's not familiar, Malcolm X was, I guess you would call like a civil rights figure back in the 50s and 60s. I read his book, and I think I'm a fan of Malcolm X. He was somewhat problematic in his own right, but Malcolm X had a lot of cool things to say. A lot of the, let's put it this way, less open-minded white folks weren't a fan. So he said, you wear your X, the Malcolm X logo, I'll wear mine, the Confederate flag shirt. Kerry King, probably not the world's coolest, most open-minded person. That shirt sucks. There's no two ways around that. Does that mean that James Hetfield is responsible for the shirt Kerry King's wearing? I would say no. On the other hand, definitely not a flattering photo. Let's put it that way. And this is true from the chat. It's cringy, but I don't judge the past by the standards of the present. I will say this. The Confederate flag stuff back then, was not... that was really not offensive back then. It probably should have been, to be clear. But, this is like Dukes of Hazzard. If you're old like me, this was like a super popular mainstream TV show in the 80s. Dukes of Hazzard, and this car had the Confederate flag on the top of it. Tons of people had the Confederate flag sticker just because they thought it looked cool. I don't think any of them meant anything by it. So it wasn't as hateful back then as it is now. That said, I'm not here to vouch for Kerry King. But is James Hetfield responsible for what Kerry King chooses to wear? I don't think he is.
And then a video of one of their former members doing a Nazi salute and march.
Okay, and here's Jason Newsted on stage, apparently doing like the, Nazi goose step type of thing. Yeah, not cool.
And I heard James say about Ice-T, because Ice-T was supposed to join us on the tour. He said, I don't want to share my stage with a N-word.
And that's the
So allegedly, James Hetfield, when they were touring or whatever, going to play a show with Ice-T, allegedly James said, I don't want to share the stage with that N-word. Obviously, I have no idea if that happened or not, but if it did, that's completely unacceptable, totally uncool. Like, that word is never okay. End of story. Like, you can't say that. Like, that's not an okay word to say, period.
It was even corroborated by Axl Rose himself.
Before the show ended, though, Rose got in a few verbal licks at GNR's one-time tour mates Metallica, especially lead singer James Hetfield, whom Rose called a racist. Apparently because Axl blames Hetfield for keeping Ice-T and Body Count off last year's GNR Metallica tour.
Source, Axl Rose, for whatever that's worth. I don't know how credible Axl Rose is, but, there's two people saying that it happened. I don't know. Seems like I wouldn't discount the possibility that it did happen.
Then there's his racism against East Asian people and his use of the O word. And making fun.
I don't know what the O word is. It said his racism against East Asian people and his use of the O word, which I guess is Oriental. I don't know what the O word is.
You don't know Kung Fu?
Yeah, you can see here. For those who don't know, here's James doing this slanty eye thing with Fig Newtons or something, and Kirk is not happy about it. For those who don't know, Kirk is Filipino. So I'm guessing that he's probably not thrilled that James is, acting this way. Probably not thrilled by it. Oh, yeah, we said all our Oriental fans. Okay, yeah, not a great word to use.
Then there was this statement that he was praised for speaking out against racism, even though at the beginning of it, they talk about how they don't care who you voted for.
So far, it seems like Metallica, in particular James, probably did and said some kind of cringy, edgy shit 20 or 30 years ago. But how many of us did the same thing 20 or 30 years ago? How many of us said something edgy and shitty and probably not very politically correct back then, including people in mainstream movies? I mean, you go watch these teen comedies from even as recently as or The Hangover. like the paging Dr. F word thing. That movie's from what, 2010? And as recently as 2010, paging Dr. F word was like a socially acceptable thing to say. I'm not endorsing that. I'm just saying that fairly recently, these were socially acceptable things to say. By the way, my stepmom used the word Oriental like 2 years ago. My wife is Vietnamese, as most of you guys know. My stepbrother is married to a Taiwanese woman. So even though my stepmom has 2 Asian daughters-in-law, she still used the word Oriental. And we were like, yeah, we don't use that word anymore. And she was like, oh, okay, I didn't know that. So I don't think that simply using the word Oriental depends on the context. But, you know, my stepmom is not like racist. She just didn't know that that was not an okay word to use.
Racism, to denounce it, then you should probably care about who people are voting for, because those people influence policies that are racist. But don't worry, they spoke about Black Lives Matter. All of them did, except for the lead singer, of course. And they did that with some black squares, no resources, and no donations.
So yes, they supported Black Lives Matter, but they didn't share the appropriate links, and they didn't publicly discuss their donations. So it doesn't count. Well, my question for Serena is, did you donate? Where are your resources? That's my question. Oh, James doesn't have social media. Well, that would explain why he didn't say anything then, wouldn't it?
And suicide. First, there's how they mocked Lane Staley's drug addiction by motioning needles going into their arms.
Okay, so they're making fun of Lane Staley from Alice in Chains, who most of you guys know overdosed, doing this sort of thing, like making fun of the fact that he OD'd. I would say that's a very shitty thing to do. But again, 20 years ago.
So quick to make fun of somebody's drug addiction, but when James himself was put into rehab, that's when they started taking drug addiction seriously.
I think she has a valid point here. They were really shitty and insensitive about Lane Staley, but then when James goes into rehab, now they start taking addiction seriously. And I think she has a valid point. On the other hand, I would say that to me, that's evidence that they grew from that. They were like, okay, well, now that someone close to us is going through this, now I realize that that's actually something to be taken seriously. So my thought in general on this so far, there's a few other examples, is if they were acting this way in the current year, I think that it would be a very different conversation than pulling up stuff that they said 20, 30 years ago. It seems to me like they were probably assholes in the 80s and 90s. And I bet you they would agree, because they were all drinking and partying a lot back then. It seems like back in the 80s, they were probably drunk, edgy fucking assholes. But unless I'm mistaken, unless there's something more recent, it seems to me that they've probably grown from that. And I think there's a larger conversation to be had here of like, why should anyone want to change if they're never forgiven for saying dumb shit in the past? If all you're going to do is just relentlessly hold someone's feet to the fire over something they said 20 years ago, 30 years ago, why should they change, right? To me, like, if the guys in Metallica were still calling people Oriental and making fun of Lane Staley for, being an addict, I would say, fuck those guys, those are assholes. But I don't think they're acting that way anymore. So I'm inclined to think that, they've probably grown.
And finally, there's how they mocked Kurt Cobain's suicide, days after it happened.
What color was Kurt Cobain's eyes? Blue. One blue this way, one blue that.
So they made this joke about Kurt Cobain's suicide, apparently days after it happened, about, made a joke about his blowing his eyes out, whatever. Super uncool. I think that's incredibly shitty of them, especially knowing this is not some local band. This is like one of the biggest bands on the planet. Knowing that his family and friends are likely to hear this, they still made this incredibly shitty joke on stage about somebody that just killed himself. I would say this is a super asshole thing to do. But again, it was 27 years ago. 27 years ago, I said a lot of really dumb, awful shit. The only difference is I didn't have a camera on me. So it would be hard for me to get up on my high horse and pretend like I didn't say stuff just as shitty 27 years ago, because I definitely fucking did.
There's probably much more of this, considering that they're a band full of white men from the 80s, but...
She said they're a band full of white men from the 80s. She might want to check her facts on that one, since, Rob and Kirk are definitely not white. Not that excuses anybody's behavior, but it just kind of makes you sound a little bit uninformed when literally 2 out of 4 people in the band aren't white. But, Minor detail.
This is all I could find for right now. So if I missed anything, please let me know.
I have a couple thoughts here. So I think if you're critical of cancel culture, as I think most people are these days, I think most people watching this would agree, like, really, you're dragging up a bunch of dumb shit that they said 20 or 30 years ago, even though it seems that they have, become different people now. And as far as anybody can tell, they're not shitty people making the same sort of like edgy comments now. Why are you doing this? Well, I think we should extend her the same grace. Nobody should be harassing her. Nobody should be coming for her and doxing her and trying to get her fired or whatever. Don't fight fire with fire. This is someone who's pretty young, and this is a mistake. She made a mistake here. So if we are going to forgive them for making mistakes 20 or 30 years ago, then I think we should do the same with her. A lot of these debates have devolved into two groups of people being angry and emotional and trying to dunk on the other side, and I think that's unfortunate to see. That said, I think that the examples that she's raised of bad behavior are legitimate. There's stuff that they said. She has video and photo evidence of it. The stuff that they did back then was shitty. There's no two ways around it. Like doing the Sieg Heil with like a Hitler mustache, making fun of Kurt Cobain right after he died. Like, that's not okay. It's not cool. End of story. So we can acknowledge that, but we can also acknowledge that from what anybody can see, the guys in the band have moved on, and unless they are horrible people now, which I don't think they are, then we probably don't need to like rake them over the coals for stuff they did 20 or 30 years ago. That's what I think. And I kind of agree with this too. Videos like this just tells everyone to hide their mistakes instead of owning up to them and trying to improve. It feels like you can never outgrow your past no matter how much you grow. All of us have said and done things that probably we wish we didn't, right? I think that in general, like, we need to just have a little bit more like grace and compassion and allow people to grow up and move on. So I agree with that. This girl is going to regret some of the things that she said too, and I hope that people forgive her when she is older, because I think that's the only way to kind of move forward. Yeah, I think this is a good question too. I would be curious as to her motivation in making this video. Is she hoping that people stop listening to Metallica? I think that people like this who participate in, maybe a better word than cancel culture, I think is more like call out culture, might be a better word for it, because they're trying to, call people out. You have to think that, what Narc says here, her motive has to be attention. Nobody who likes Metallica will think of them any differently. People who are canceling them probably didn't give a fuck about them to begin with. Exactly. I think that she's just trying to get attention for this. And look, she looks pretty young. So again, I think it's important not to come for her. Like, being nasty and shitty to her is not the right course of action either. Just, people should just let this stuff go. Yeah, I think this is true too. Gothic Hybrid said we're also entering into a post-consequences era too. One of the reasons why I oppose videos like this and call out culture in general is because it makes people stop giving a shit. I believe it's counterproductive, because if you're going to do a 65 episode series trying to call out, every artist under the sun for every quote unquote problematic thing they've ever done, people are going to stop listening to you. And so what that means is that when you do raise a legitimate complaint, nobody's going to care. They're going to be like, oh, it's that person who's just always trying to call everyone out. Whatever. We're not going to listen. People get exhausted of this stuff, which is a problem, because there are people out there who are legitimately problematic, who should get quote unquote canceled. And by making a big deal out of everything, you actually kind of enable those people to kind of get noticed less. So I think that's a problem. The other thing I would say is that, if you are going to call people or things out, save your outrage for things that actually matter, because there's a lot of really awful shit in the world. Climate change, for example, like how many various different like civil wars and like awful humanitarian tragedies are there that should be talked about. Like, Lars and James saying something stupid in 1988, that's not where your energy should go. So I understand you're not going to get as much attention and clout from talking about some sort of like humanitarian crisis on the other side of the world. But if you actually want to make a difference, you should save your energy for that rather than, trying to attack Lars and James, which is not going to make a difference anyway. That's pretty much my thoughts on it. I think that this is kind of much ado about nothing, but I do want to be clear. Like, I actually wasn't aware of all this stuff that they had said and done back in the day. I was initially expecting this to be kind of overblown, but I don't think it is. I mean, it's legitimately kind of I think they're jokes, but they're racist jokes. There's no way around that. Like, you got to admit that. Like, this stuff is not cool. And, you know, I want to be clear that I don't think it's okay to say that kind of stuff. So those are my thoughts on it. I don't think that being an edgelord is cool, but I also don't think it makes you like a horrible person. And I think everyone should just move on. That is what I think. So there we have it. Metallica is canceled by TikTok. The end. Their career is over. That's it.